Audience and the way they receive news has changed drastically since the 1950s. This is due to the audience receiving news from different media platforms due to technological developments such as newspapers, television, radio and social media. Also, the audience positioning in the interpretation of mass media has developed and changed significantly. It is through Hall's encoding-decoding paradigm that audience respond differently to the same text through dominant, negotiated and oppositional readings. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, it is noted that due to lack of news resources, the audience was categorised into a dominant reading, as they usually fully accepted the preferred reading. Currently, due to unlimited access to news from internet and social media, the audience era of the 1990s to the present has taken to an oppositional stance as the readers begin to question the news and have the power to reject what they've been told. However, there are still continuities that remain in the way the audience receives and reacts to news media. These continuities are news production, agenda settings, dominant discourse and media conglomerates.
I prefer to receive my news either by the radio while I'm driving to work, or occasionally in the afternoon if I have time I'll sit down and watch the news headlines.
I like a mix because of the number of choices that we have. These days the mix allows you to choose what it is that you like in a much more personal way.
From the radio
Yeah.
and from the TV. Also from a paper, the Courier Mail or the Telegraph.
In the decade between the 1950s and 1960s, between strikes and price increases within the newspaper production companies, print news sources were sparse. Devereux mentioned Stuart Hall's 1974 encoding-decoding model, which is largely based on audience agency and their capacity to independently interpret, reject and resist dominant readings, particularly when audiences understand the media messages conveyed through newspapers via the dominant code, meaning that they were less critical and more accepting of what they were told. The year of 1950 brought a more negotiated approach as more newspapers were made available to the public on a daily basis. Additionally, by 1956, the moving picture was brought into people's homes through black and white television. With the introduction of TV, audiences had access to alternate news sources which they could watch in their family homes together. So by the mid-1960s, television had truly taken hold as the most popular form of communication, and by 1965, 9 in 10 Australian families owned a television set. It transmitted ideas into Australia faster than ever before, and the public's awareness and experience of the rest of the world was vastly changed. Although it was prior to this decade a prime example of the dominant approach that news media had upon audiences was the famous radio broadcast in 1938, War of the Worlds, when radio listeners across the US heard reports of an alien invasion moving towards New York City. The first part of the one-hour drama was presented as a news bulletin. However, as some listeners may have missed the introduction of the broadcast, they would not have known it was simply Orson Welles' adaptation of the classic programme. Through added complications, the drama resulted in mass panic and caused outrage within newspapers and between public figures of the media because of the terror it caused. Overall, TV transformed the way information was received and produced, and soon became Australia's dominant form of mass communication, challenging the production of newspapers and radio broadcasts as well as audience engagement.
I suppose what stayed the same is that still the major media conglomerates are the ones who control what we see and what we hear, and their viewpoint is what they put across.
What stayed the same for me is there's still the radio news, there's still the TV news, and there are still newspapers. But it's the choice, the concentration and the access that's significantly changed as far as I can see.
Throughout the 1970s and 80s, as media became more advanced and television news became more diverse, audiences began seeing people other than white men deliver their news. Although women had been seen on screen with advertisements, it was extremely rare for women to be seen on a news panel or within a television news programme. During this time that local stations began delivering the news in teams behind the news desk, often the presenters being a mix of genders and cultural backgrounds. Show business began influencing the news at national levels. As colour television emerged, the overall design of news programmes became much more complex. The focus shifted to bringing people information they wanted to see rather than what they needed to know. So when TV newscasts appeared the same, no matter which state you're in, television networks decided their news teams needed to be friendly and funny, which began an era of some called happy talk, which still exists today, such as Channel 7 Sunrise. This kind of conversational tone between the hosts and programme viewers became a critical part in developing and maintaining relationships. It was also during these decades that live television became possible, allowing audiences to receive news faster than ever before. However, the 1980s reflected a change in news production, as more people became news critics and began studying the media, creating a more negotiated approach to news programmes.
Now, I think it's helpful to question what news and media sources publish, because often it can be biased and politically influenced, and I think trying to read through that and interpret it with your own opinions is important.
Not necessarily, it's only one person's interpretation.
During the 90s, community and subscription television was introduced, along with the internet, each becoming a part of Australian homes. As news organisations developed their first email systems and websites to communicate with the public in a new way, viewers' new accessibility was broadened. However, at this time it was unknown as to how dramatically the internet in particular would directly affect them as news providers. The 2000s brought huge amounts of change to the industry, with new technology available and a number of massive worldly events such as the 2000 Sydney Olympics and the 9/11 terrorist attacks. News coverage began to take over the distribution process of the news. Website developments allowed videos and information to be shared easily by viewers, confronting news organisations with dilemmas they were unaware of. The decade of 2010 brought numerous digital developments, meaning it became harder for news producers to determine exactly what audiences wanted from a TV news bulletin. With so many options now, viewers can choose where they receive information from, and sitting down to watch the local news as a family is rapidly becoming a habit of generations past, with very little relevance to today's news consumers. Television stations are also changing their priorities in order to deliver information across a variety of platforms, such as social sites like Facebook, targeting people on the go. As social media has had the most recent impact on news production and reception, it has allowed the audiences to be more oppositional in their stance towards media today. This means, with so many new ways to access the news, we are now questioning media conglomerates. Citizen journalism has empowered audiences and allows individuals to share their opinions and beliefs in an instant. With access to a wider range of news outlets, they now have the ability to become more critical and analyse traditional news sources.